The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed deep-seated inequalities and significant gaps in social protection everywhere. The ILO's latest World Social Protection Report shows recent developments with new data and statistics. It reveals that only 46.9% of the global population are covered by at least one social protection benefit. This means that barely 18.6% of unemployed workers receive unemployment benefits. Only 26.4% of children and less than 29% of vulnerable persons are covered. A mere third of working-age people have access to sickness benefits by law, and only 33.4% of persons with severe disabilities receive disability benefits, while 44.9% of mothers with newborns receive a maternity benefit. 33% of the population are not covered by a social health protection scheme, and 22.5% of older persons still receive no pension. However, the pandemic provoked an unparalleled social protection response as a primary tool to protect people's health, jobs, and incomes. But with an uncertain recovery, further social protection spending to ensure social stability is crucial. Nearly all countries, irrespective of their development level, have arrived at a crossroads and face a choice: whether to pursue a high-road strategy of strengthening their social protection systems, or a low-road strategy of chronic underinvestment, minimalist provision, and succumbing to austerity. The choices made will have a severe impact on generations to come, so now is the time for countries to heed the pandemic's lessons. Establishing universal social protection is possible, as realizing the human right to social security for all is the cornerstone of a human-centered approach to finally obtaining social justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. And a warm welcome to the global launch of the World Social Protection Report 2020 to 2022 in pursuit of a better future. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it is an absolute privilege to moderate this critically important conversation today. We've connected from far and wide to engage with the recommendations of the report to bring into sharp focus the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, in which social protection has been and continues to be a critical part of the policy response. And so we're going to hire the next 90 minutes to really connect, to engage, to challenge, and to listen in to some of those recommendations, especially as they might influence our near and longer term policy priorities. Of course, as always, we are amplifying this conversation on social media. So if you are following on any social media platform, the hashtags that we are using is hashtag social protection and hashtag USP 2030. We're following the handle at SOC_protection, at SOC_protection. Now, we would really love to have your voice included in this conversation. And so we're going to do that in two ways. The one way is to extend an invitation to you to please send through your questions, your comments in our high-level panel that we're going to be having. And I will try, to the best of my ability, to integrate your voice and to pull in some of your questions into the conversation. The other way in which we're going to really have an inclusive conversation is through the audience polls. So from time to time in the conversation, we're going to pause, we're going to launch a poll that really gives us a sense of your thoughts on some of the key issues that we're going to be discussing together. And of course, as always, we have simultaneous interpretation. So in addition to English, we are also able to listen in Arabic, in French, in Spanish, in Portuguese, Russian, and of course, you'll see on the screen right now my colleague Tina, who is leading us in international sign language, and my colleague Maya will also be participating in that surface as well. So it's a warm welcome to all of you today. Now, before we get to our panel, it is my singular pleasure to open up the space now to invite the Deputy Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Her Excellency Madame Amina Mohammed, to extend and share with us her opening remarks to this global event.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to join this launch of the ILO World Social Protection Report. Access to social protection is a human right and an economic and social necessity. Yet social protection is a distant dream for far too many around the world. The COVID-19 crisis is erasing hard-won development gains. This will only be further compounded by catastrophic natural disasters. Those living on the margins of society will be hit the hardest unless immediate action is taken. By stepping up investments to strengthen social protection systems, we can put in place powerful anti-poverty measures while supporting a just transition, making the world more prepared, resilient, and inclusive. Today's report highlights the need for 3 urgent actions. First, investments in social protection must be integrated into long-term development strategies and development planning. Second, we must step up efforts to ensure greater access to social protection and social services for everyone. Limited access to social protection further curtails access to health services, education, unemployment, pensions, and food, undermining the entire 2030 agenda. Third, the development of social protection systems, including social protection floors, requires strong stakeholder commitment. I'm encouraged by growing support by governments, employers, workers, NGOs, and civil society organizations. But we must better seize current opportunities to get where we want to go. Developed countries should redistribute their special drawing rights to developing countries in support of social protection, including in middle-income countries where 8 out of 10 of the world's new poor live. Such an agreement would be a game changer for billions of people. This and other actions will be discussed in the upcoming high-level event on jobs and social protection for poverty eradication on the 28th of September. The findings of this comprehensive report will also inform this event and help bolster global advocacy efforts to strengthen social protection systems. This is essential to make economies productive, societies equitable, and the SDGs achievable. Thank you.
That's a massive thank you to Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. And of course, the call to action and the invitation is clear. She has emphasized action. She has emphasized how that action might really help us to accelerate our journey towards the Sustainable Development Goals and really bring within reach those targets by 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, as I introduce our panelists now for this high-level discussion, allow me first just to contextualize our conversation. What we've heard and what we see in the report is that, of course, the pandemic has exposed existing inequalities, and it exposed underlying and deep-seated gaps, especially in social protection coverage, in its comprehensiveness, as well as its adequacy. And we know that all of these together undermine our social development objectives. They undermine decent work and certainly undermine social justice as well. We've seen an unparalleled response to the COVID-19 crisis, and so there might be lessons for us to concretize and lift. And so in this conversation, we're going to explore that as well. We're also going to explore the reality that socioeconomic recovery remains uncertain. What is the role of social protection, and where are the policy windows that policymakers could take advantage of to really strengthen social protection systems? And finally, in this conversation, we're going to ask ourselves, what can countries do to establish universal social protection for all by 2030? And with that, it's my singular pleasure to welcome the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Guy Ryder, who joins us today. It's my pleasure to extend a welcome to Madame Michelle Bachelet, who is, of course, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Welcome to you, Madame. It's my pleasure to welcome Madame Henrietta Fore, who joins us today in her capacity as Executive Director of UNICEF. We're also joined by Mr. Philip Alston, who is a John Norton Pomeroy Professor of Law, and this at New York University School of Law. Welcome to you, sir. And we'd be more than happy for you to also put your camera on so we can see you as we introduce you. Allow me to also extend a special welcome to Madame Sharon Burrow. She is, of course, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Madame, welcome to you. And last but certainly not least in this conversation is Mr. Roberto Suarez Santos, who's also here with us. He is, of course, the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers. So to you, Mr. Suarez, Madame Barrow, we'd also love to see you on our screens. There we go. A massive welcome to both of you. So in this first round of questions, I'm going to invite all of my panelists, with the exception of the DG, to pop off their cameras so we can have International Sign Language Interpreter on screen. And so to you, Mr. Guy Ryder, let's go to the report as our starting point. What are the three takeaways? The three takeaway points that you have lifted out of the report and stand out for you in the report?
Thanks, Nosy. And firstly, my greetings to all my friends and fellow panelists who do so much to promote the work of the ILO, particularly in the space of social protection. Those three key messages, Nosy, I can list them very, very quickly. The first has to do with the experience of the COVID-19 period. I think if it's done one thing, it has exposed in the starkest, sometimes a very brutal way, just how important social protection is as a social policy issue. It's almost as if we could divide the world up in the context of the pandemic between those who did have access to social protection and so could have healthcare assured, maybe their incomes and jobs safeguarded, their enterprises stabilized, and those who did not have all of that. I mean, it makes an extraordinary difference to the experience of crisis. And what did we see during the pandemic? Well, we saw a rush to ad hoc emergency temporary social protection measures in the circumstances of pandemic. And that brings me to the second message. You know, all of those ad hoc measures were necessary because the pre-existing status quo was so inadequate. We saw the percentage figures in the opening video. We weren't doing as well in the provision of social protection as we should have been. Yes, there were some areas of advance, but certainly nothing that would take us anywhere near where we need to get at the speed that we need to get there. So we really are very clear in our report. The figures are there, the statistics speak for themselves, that we have to reinforce social protection policies. We have to make a particular effort to extend social protection to all types of employment in an increasingly diversified labor market. We have to reach out particularly to those who we know are particularly ill-served by existing arrangements. I think of women, I think of migrant workers, I think of informal economy workers, and in perhaps a slightly different optic, I think also of gig workers, the latest addition, if you like, to the panoply of work forms. And then the third, and I think that for me, the key message, we have some choices to make right now in the light of the COVID-19 experience, in the light of the evident inadequacies of what existed pre-pandemic. You know, as the pressure is going to come on to relax or remove the emergency ad hoc measures, we can either fall back into the pre-existing status quo with all of its inadequacies and say, sorry, we can't do better than that. Our resources are not there. Our political will is not there. People are going to have to get by pretty much as they always did. We call this the low road on social protection. Or alternatively, we can take the high road. And the high road means investing. And yes, there is a major investment effort required here. Invest in a true push towards universal social protection, which is precisely what the world has already committed to in the 2030 agenda. It's 1.3 in the SDGs, and make it a reality. Make that a reality, which I would close by saying necessarily means an effort at the national level, establishing the right types of national policy priorities and capacities and resource inputs, and then an effort of international solidarity. One of the figures that stands out for me in the report is that the financing gap that would allow us, if filled, to provide minimum social protections for the low-income countries. That financing gap stands at $79 billion annually. And in the light of what's been spent in the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, that does not seem beyond our reach. Thanks.
Director General, thank you very much for lifting up those takeaway points, but really also framing the opportunity of the conversation that we could have here, especially as you land on the third takeaway of the choice that we have to make. Are we going to take the high road or the low road? And of course, bringing in the exact figures that really help us to understand the size of the financing gap so we can contextualize it against what we know is possible. There's many lessons for us to lift from the COVID crisis, and certainly that we can finance is one of those. I'd like to now go to Madame Bachelet. And Madame Bachelet, a similar question, but really calling on you to zoom in on the compelling messages of the report with regard to achieving the human right to social security. What has stood out for you?
Well, thank you, Nosy. Yes, I think one of the things, key messages from the report is that the social security is a human right. And because it also, you know, it's very relevant to the exercise of many other rights, but also to the right to live in dignity, if I may say. But yet, as we just saw at the beginning, only half of the world population is covered. But we also know from the report and from other concrete experience of many countries that social protection can be achieved in low-income countries. So the high road is possible. And I think what is clear here is political will, because there is this old saying, if there is a will, there is a way. And of course, there will be needed international cooperation. The other thing that everybody has mentioned that, of course, is very clear is how COVID-19 has highlighted the insufficient spending in public service, such as social protection or healthcare. And that has meant not only that the country were not prepared to respond to the COVID-19, but also it has been exacerbating long existing inequalities. The report also highlights the need, and we are also talk about, of long-term investment. I mean, we all know that countries have responded with short-term actions that, of course, they might have been helpful in some places. Some have been very local and very temporary. And what we need is something different. If we need to build back better after COVID-19, we need to invest longer term in comprehensive and universal systems covering all. That means informal workers, irregular migrants, so everyone can be covered without discrimination. The other issue that I want to point out is that social protection must be gender responsive. One of the things that we have seen on COVID-19 is that even though the virus can affect everyone, it affects disproportionately certain vulnerable groups, not because they're inherently vulnerable, it's because they have been historically discriminated and marginalized. And that's why we see women and girls, older people, people living with disabilities, people on the move, you know, migrants, refugees, IDPs, LGBTI communities, Afro descent in many places, indigenous groups, rural people. So we need, and of course, gender. So we need to, social protection must correct the imbalance of unequal burden of work by women, because the report says that 45% of women with a newborn receive certain maternity benefits, and that older women are the biggest on risk because many of them did not work. I mean, they work but at home, or they work in the informal work, so they didn't have access to those kind of benefits. The last thing I want to point out, even though probably my dear friend Henrietta will speak more about that, is that only 26% of children receive social protection that they should be at the center to address growing child poverty. So we should have child benefits, child care services, parental leave, access to health care, among others. Sorry, Henrietta, but I'm a pediatrician. I cannot not speak about women and children. Thank you, Nosy.
Madame Bachelet, you're doing an excellent job, including throwing the baton to our next speaker, which is excellent. But before I bring on, Madame Ford, I think what you've really put on the table is really critical for us to pause and engage with it, and that is social protection is a human right, and therefore all other actions should flow from that understanding. And of course, you've lifted the importance of political will, of international cooperation, and the vulnerable groups, and bringing bring the gender lens to how we think about social protection. So you've brought children into the conversation as well. So Madame Faure, let me come to you with this question now. We know that the report section on children was jointly authored by UNICEF. So what does the report have to say regarding children's access to the right to social protection?
Well, thank you very much, Nosy. And thank you very much to all of our friends and colleagues at ILO and to the DG Guy Ryder for your leadership in this. And to Dr. Bachelet, never forget, is a pediatrician at heart. So thank you very much, Nosy. So what it says is that there's a devastating impact for children. And why is that? Guy mentioned that conflict and climate change and the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic was hitting very hard on families. But what happens to children? We see from these statistics that children are hit the hardest. So the numbers are that children are twice as likely to live in income poor households than others. It also shows that there are more children that are entering into poverty. So right now, 725 million children worldwide are in income poor households, and that number will increase by 142 million. That's an extraordinarily large number, Nosy. So as we think about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, access to social protection is a very important part of this. It is not just for the children themselves, but it is for our world. So SDGs 1 and 2 on poverty and on nutrition, hunger, will not be reached if we don't overcome these barriers for social protection. Social protection is an evidence-based investment, and that makes it something very understandable for our world. And it's particularly important for the poorest and the most marginalized children in our society and families in our society. So the report shows that 73.6% of all children worldwide, or 1.5 billion children, do not have any access to a child or a family benefit. It climbs to nearly 90% of all children in Africa. And 55% of all mothers with a newborn child do not have access to any form of maternity benefit, something that Michelle and Guy have both pointed out. The report also says that there is a critical role and a central role about the economic consequences of the pandemic. Many governments during this pandemic have had limited fiscal space. It means that they've had to reduce benefits to one area or another for their society. But there are some who have made extraordinary benefits, pardon me, even in the time of the pandemic. And so we've highlighted some of them. So there are national and subnational examples: the EU, Indonesia, Thailand, United States. So we invite everyone to read the report. If we are going to lift children and families out of poverty, we need social protection. So with that, Nosy, I turn it back to you because I think the case is clear. We need social protection.
The case is crystal clear, Madame Faure. And again, you've done an excellent job of linking us all the way back to the Sustainable Development Goals 1 and 2, even as we talk about social protection today, but also the case studies and examples within the report that really allow us to see the frame of possibility and how other governments and regions have gone about, notwithstanding the crisis, extending social protection. And so with that, I'm going to invite Mr. Alston into the conversation. And maybe just to be a little bit more candid here, Mr. Alston, I think Director General Guy Ryder also spoke about this, the fact that there's been a lot of talk about the unprecedented COVID-19 social protection response and how this crisis has been what could be described as a game changer for social protection. However, having said that, we also know that some of these response measures were temporary, were inadequate, and even at times insensitive to the very needs of the situation and in particular groups. My question to you is, what are your reactions to some of these observations? And what, in your view, are the burning issues of the day that we've got to keep the spotlight on?
Thanks, Nozi. I think this is it's an excellent report and very timely. I think in some ways, the most important phrase in the report for me is that mindsets have changed. I think it is true that we can now talk about economic stimulus, we can talk about deficit spending, and maybe even the end of austerity in some contexts. Thanks in part to COVID and also to global reactions to rampant inequality, we've come a very long way since the ILO began pushing for social protection, and since Michelle Bachelet published her sort of landmark report back in 2011. The report recounts a lot of very positive developments, and of course I welcome those. But the biggest question, in a way, is sustainability. Is this a sort of temporary panic response to the pandemic, or is it sustainable in the longer term? Now, the ILO's focus, quite appropriately, is on social protection per se, but there are bigger questions, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of those. The most important, in a way, is, are we looking at the necessary structural changes? There's a real parallel here with the report, again, that Michelle Bachelet presented to the Human Rights Council in response to the killing of George Floyd. Better investigations, prosecutions, and so on, very important. But really, it's a question of deep, baked-in systemic problems. And the question is whether we are addressing those in relation to social protection. The report and the ILO generally emphasizes solidarity. Of course, that's crucial. And it's been good to see the OECD coming up with a minimum global tax proposal, which we hope will get through. But otherwise, we've not seen an awful lot of real solidarity. We've seen vaccine nationalism pretty rampant. We've seen a reluctance to acknowledge, even though the Deputy Secretary General mentioned the link between COVID and climate change. COVID is in so many ways a trial run for what climate change is going to bring on a continuing basis. I think we also need to acknowledge that COVID has been a setback in the human rights area in terms of states of emergency, repression of demonstrations, non-participatory top-down solutions, and so on. So the question is, what's going to make social protection sustainable in the future? We obviously need to tackle inequality, but seriously. We hear, if the IMF is concerned about inequality, then the rest of us should be terrified. We really need to rethink the approach to fiscal consolidation. And if we read the latest Oxfam report, we see that we're not doing particularly well on that. It is still being pushed by the IMF. We need to restore a belief in the role of government. We need to see social protection beyond notions of conditionality, means testing, deservedness, and so on, which again still tend to dominate the way the World Bank and others think about social protection. And we need to put privatization into perspective. There's no doubt that the private sector can do a lot, but the private sector won't bring social protection to the masses, and it won't achieve the sustainable development goals for those who most need them. Pressures to privatize are rampant from the World Bank, from the IMF, and even the UN seems to be embracing privatization as an act of desperation in the absence of adequate resources. But all of the studies show that privatization, while improving the lot of the well-off, does not address the plight of the worst off. And we have to keep it in perspective. I've just completed a study on privatisation in the UK bus sector, which seems a very long way from where we are, but it's nonetheless very illustrative. The fact that privatisation was launched in the 80s by Thatcher, all of the claims that were made for improved services, lower fares, etc., have been proven to be unwarranted. And even a Conservative government is now edging back towards an important government role in centralising in some way an overview of the bus sector. That's important for the rest of us in terms of social protection. In the absence of strong government leadership, we won't get it. We cannot abdicate it to the private sector. Final point, we need to always bear in mind the key importance of social movements in all of this. The labour movement, broader environmental movements, and other social groups are the ones that will really bring government support for social protection. All of the international reports won't do that on their own. So we need to think how we can translate what is in this report into real grassroots social action. Thank you.
Mr. Austin, thank you so much. I think so many of us have been scribbling as you're writing, because you're bringing to the surface what you have described as the bigger questions that we shouldn't be missing. Of course, the overarching question is what needs to be true for social protection to be sustainable? And you've raised questions around structural changes. You've raised questions around a real solidarity and not just lip service of solidarity. You've cautioned against the fact that COVID is a trial run for what climate change could do. And I know that we're going to be speaking about climate change with Sharon Burrow in a short while. The role of government and restoring belief in government and seeing that leadership as that restoration and credibility. You've lifted some thoughts around what does it mean and what could it mean to go beyond conditionality, to get to the root of the problem, which is inequality, and not just to play at the surface. And of course, as you talk about social movements, you're talking about labor movements as well. And so it's fitting that we go to Madame Sharon Burrow now, because Madam, if we look at the report, it's quite clear that it states that social dialogue has often led to better social protection and employment responses from workers and employers. For you, as you have engaged with this report, what are the lessons learned from the crisis, and what are trade unions' key priorities for extending social protection? And you're more than welcome to respond to any of the other insights that we've heard so far. Over to you, Madam Burrow.
Well, Amina launched the notion of resilience. If we have no resilience, if there is no capacity to protect people against global shocks or personal shocks, then everybody suffers. The economy suffers. In this case, there's a health crisis. You know, people suffer everywhere. And COVID-19 dramatically exposed the need for social protection, particularly access to health and income guarantees. But equally, the lack of social protection exposed the devastation for unprotected workers and their families. The containment of the virus, when workers had no choice but to go to work, or their families indeed couldn't eat. And we also know that, in fact, those countries that had universal social protection systems already in place were able to respond much more rapidly, to scale them up with social dialogue, and to effectively deal with the health and economic shocks that generated unemployment in this crisis. Indeed, they were much more socially and economically resilient. It must be recognised, of course, that in all of those countries, social dialogue was the foundation for the maintenance and extension of social protection systems. The report points this out really successfully and looked at how governments in those situations moved to respond to those falling through the cracks. Now, as trade unions, we're asking for a new social contract. And one of the 5 demands is universal social protection, because that is the foundation for resilience, even as we demand investment in jobs, climate-friendly jobs with just transition, rights, equality and inclusion, all of those elements of decent work. but you cannot see social protection as a cost. People focus on the cost of social protection. Our research shows that investment in social protection can actually yield up to 1.9 times the value in economic returns. So even if you take people out of the equation and look at the economy, which we should never do, those arguments are false. The crisis has also shown that investment in social protections are affordable, but solidarity demands that we generate greater international support to help the world's lowest income countries develop both the fiscal space and, of course, you saw, Kristalina and other leaders in the international movement fight for debt relief. But we must do more than that. To develop social protection systems, we need a global social protection fund. And the ultimate example of social dialogue at the global level was that this was debated by the International Labour Conference just in June, where governments, employers and trade unions jointly called on the ILO to initiate international discussions to develop concrete proposals for setting up a fund. It's very simple. If we don't have the resilience that guarantees safety and security, then none of us is safe, if indeed everyone is not safe.
Madame Barrow, I'm going to pick up on your last point because it matches one of the questions that had come through from the audience. Neil Coleman was talking exactly about what you're saying the ITUC has proposed a global social protection fund. This seems like a good idea, says Neil, given the global unevenness of social protection, which the report reveals. And just to appreciate how you've lifted, of course, the conversation that I actually want to take to Mr. Suarez, and that is the reframing of social protection as a cost and more reframing it as an investment with clear returns. And maybe that's what I want to come with to you, Mr. Suarez Santos, because we do know that sometimes social protection is dismissed as antithetical to the needs of enterprises and it's framed as a cost. However, if we pause and we reflect on what we've seen during this crisis, we've seen that social protection has been absolutely key for enterprises who've survived the turmoil. And I think we go back to Madame Barrow's words, resilience. We've seen that resilience coming through in the private sector space. The question to you then, Mr. Santos, is what are the key lessons learned with regards to the value of social protection for sustainable enterprise that we need to bring to the surface?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation here. I think that it's out of doubt that there is a business case for social protection. There is also a social case, an incredible social case for business, for social protection. And of course, there is also a macroeconomic case for social protection. We've witnessed that in the recent past, in many countries, developed and developing countries, but also we witnessed that during this crisis. And I want to bring the example, and this is an example in which Sharon and myself have been working intensively. When the pandemic started, and the ILO was very much involved, and I want to thank the ILO for that, we had a big challenge in one of the sectors, which is the garment sector, because all of a sudden, many of the orders from the companies have to be redressed or have, and so there was an issue of also suppliers not being able also to cope with the income salary obligations for the workers. And we had to act quickly. We had to act urgently to mobilize resources, but also to think in a different manner. Whether we were successful or not mobilizing resources, that's to be seen. But what I can tell you is that we are now entering into a dynamic of building social protection schemes, which has a big political push in many developing countries. The reasoning is because there is an important business case. This is in the interest of no one not to assure some income when exceptional circumstances occur, but also when you have a health, and safety issue, where also when you have also a need to promote transition from one job to the other. The question is, and I go back to the sustainability model that we want to build, that Phil was referring to. The question is how. And what we are witnessing now with this push that we are bringing together is that it's very common the case that in many of the countries that need to build these social protections, you have weak institutions, you have corruption, which is a big obstacle to build social protection schemes. You have big informality. Again, in many of them, low-income countries, 90% of the occupied population is informality, which means that sometimes you don't have even registered workers. Something like a DNI, I mean, you don't have it there. Sometimes what you don't have is a culture of social doubt. So bringing together employee organizations and workers' organizations is a big issue. And having a kind of, mutual understanding also with the government need a big political support. Sometimes the problem is that even though you have all these ingredients, you don't have the fiscal capacity, and let's recognize that. We need also to boost, to some extent, there is a business case, but we need to boost it. And which leads me to the final important point. What you also need is a macroeconomic policy, which is employment growth based, which is productivity growth based, and we take very much into account the business environment to grow. And that's far away from being the case. So the good thing is that now we have two important ingredients. We have a big political push, and this big political push is not just from the ILO. ILO needs to play a leading role, and I want to insist on that. Also, when you refer to initiatives like the initiative of a global fund or not global fund, I think the ILO has a leading role to play. But also that we need to bring other partners. And here having with us Michelet, Henrietta, is what makes a difference, but also the IMF, also the World Bank. I mean, this partnership approach is what will make a difference. So that's my main message right now.
Mr. Santos, again, it's an excellent contribution because it raises for us a question that says, what needs to be true in order for us to implement? And you've taken us straight to the how to say, we've got to answer a few more questions so that our how pathways become increasingly clear. How are we going to take on corruption? What about informality? What about the spaces that do not have social dialogue? And how do we create the space for that? How do we get to shared understanding between government and other stakeholders? But also, let's be courageous about the fiscal capacity conversation and think about how do we support, using macroeconomic policy as an example, both employment and productivity focused interventions that work hand in hand with social protection. Now, thank you very much for that. The conversation is far from over, but one of the promises that I did make is that we're going to tap into the voice of our audience through our polls to really get a sense of what they're thinking on some of these issues. I've also got a couple of questions that you've sent through to me, and I'll bring those through shortly. For now, though, let's launch this quick poll. The poll is going to come up on your screen shortly, and you're going to be able to vote. And there it is. It is, which share of the unemployed receive unemployment benefits? Is it 48.2%? Is it 74.3%? Or is it 18.6%? And of course, the second question is also up on screen for you. What proportion of the labor force has legally guaranteed sickness benefits? Is it 33%, 66%, or 75%? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds just to make a quick response on that one. And thereafter, I'm going to ask the team if we can project the responses. Let's get a sense of what our audience thinks the answers to these poll questions are. And as they come up, I'm going to really do a quick reflection on those responses, and then we're going to go back into our questions. And so to the team, if we can pop up the responses very quickly, there they are on the screen. And so there we have it, to the very first question, very much in line with what we heard in our video, very much in line with what we've heard in the conversation. And we're seeing that 75% of the audience landing on that 18.6%. That is indeed the share of the unemployed who receive the share of the unemployed who actually receive unemployment benefits. And of course, to the second question, 83% landing on 33%. What proportion of the labor force has legally guaranteed sickness benefits? Now, you might be asking yourself, why these particular questions? Of course, these two particular themes are stood out for their conspicuous absence And this is, of course, one of the findings that were picked up from the report. And so from the poll, let's go into a few questions now. And maybe, Mr. Alston, I want to bring this question to you from our audience. It's from Rodolph. And Rodolph is saying, I agree with the mindset shift that is being called for, but how do we move, asks Rodolph, from a change in mindset to the actual practical realization of social protection for all?
I think that's an excellent question. And that was what I was getting at in my final comment by saying that all of the reports in the world won't actually bring the most essential step. The mindset, and again, Michelle Bachelet picked this out of the report, the fact that the report says that social protection is a human right, social security is a human right. I think that is what it's really all about. We need to start conveying the sense that a government that does not provide social protection is not actually legitimate. That's one of the key functions of government. And if you can't do that, get out of the way, let another government in. It's not about bringing in more investment as such. It's not about many of the other things that governments obsess about. It's about ensuring that every one of your citizens really enjoys a right to social protection. And we have to start talking in those terms, and we have to start making demands of governments in those terms. And this needs to be picked up more broadly by social movements around the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alston. And again, I think that the line you opened with is certainly the line I think that really captures it, that a government that does not provide social protection is an illegitimate government. And what if we took on that stance in terms of the governments that we then vote into office and keep in office? And you're bringing in a whole conversation around against what are we holding our governments accountable? And certainly social protection needs to be one of those pillars that we're bringing into that accountability relationship. And so as we go on into the conversation, I really want us to pause now as we think about, the fact that what we've heard so far and reinforced by the report is that social protection has always been important. However, now with added challenges like climate breakdown, we are now seeing a situation that absolutely cannot be ignored. One of the things that the DG said in his opening statement is that we have a choice. We can lurch from one crisis to the next, or we can take the high road that enables us to navigate crises as we encounter them. And so as we now turn to this last part of our conversation, we really want to focus on the priority actions that need to be taken so that social protection is fit for purpose for everyone and is achievable by 2030. And so I'm going to go to Madame Bachelet first with this question. And Madame, the question to you is, how do we make the right to social protection a reality for all? What has to happen to achieve this? And the emphasis is on what needs to happen.
Well, Nosy, first of all, I want to mention that there can be a temptation from some member states that not learn the lessons from COVID-19, the real lessons, and to try to go back to normal, if I may say, and not acknowledge that normality has brought us where we are. Because we have seen before COVID-19, 80 countries, people protesting on the street, not happy with the economic models and with the political models, that are not bringing them the welfare and not solving the problems they need. So I completely agree with Phil Alston when he was saying we need to also look at the structural reasons and the root causes of all of this. Otherwise, we're not going to solve the problems. We're going to depend on the will of some and not on the others. So I think that state could be tempted to introduce fiscal reforms that impose cuts in social spending in areas like health, education, of course, social protection, housing, etc. So the first of all, I would say we need to avoid that. We need to avoid reforms, fiscal reforms that cut on health, housing, social protection, and others. Also because the experience show, I mean, we know after the economic crisis some years ago, that was the austerity measures were the response. And we know that what they do is that they undermine social, economic rights and many times other kind of rights, and also fuels discontent and social unrest. When I was in office, I really invested in social protection because I really believe it was important, pension reform of women. And I have to say, this was a cost, of course, but it also boosted economic growth and social cohesion. So you have to look at it as an investment in people, in the best that you have in a country as a human right, but also on the best you can do in concrete on the human rights of people. I think that the state must take a targeted action using maximal available resources, including through international cooperation to ensure social protection for all. And the UN has already been working on the thing of debts of countries, et cetera, and other kind of measures that can be help particularly middle income or low income countries. The second thing that can be done, and in many countries we have did it, is macroeconomic policies and reform underpinning this action include things like progressive taxation, and as it was mentioned before, of course, fighting corruption, and also stopping illicit financial flows. All of those things are really important to address, and they can be done. The other thing that, of course, international cooperation is critical, and a human rights obligation as well, because low-income countries have challenges. They're struggling in terms of mobilizing fiscal space. I do believe, though, that always fiscal space can be mobilized, because when you don't have much, you need to prioritize. You need to define what is important. That's what I say, when there is a will, there is a way, because no country has all the money they wanted. So you need to prioritize, and you need to think what is more important and to support your people, and also the other challenges of the economy, social cohesion, and so on. And finally, I want to say that investing in social protection systems pay off in the short term, and also mitigates crisis in the long term, because promotes human development, economic productivity, and resilience, as Amina was mentioning. All of this, it linked also to the calls that we have been doing in the UN and the Secretary General in particular, and in terms of looking at the world differently than it was before, in terms of a new social contract, and the need also for a new global order, so that we can really have a word. And in terms of the Global Protection Fund, we have been pushing with that for some time, and I hope it goes well.
Madame Bachelet, again, some really clear recommendations when it comes to the practical how, which of course is the question that we put: how do we move to make it a reality for all? And you've reinforced some of the points around resource mobilization. I probably just want to highlight one of those, and that's that what you've said: where there's a will, there is a way. And so fiscal space is never always without trade-offs. And so those priorities are a reflection of what we are saying, if we are government, as important. And so we need to be mindful about the agency we can still exercise in that space. I've got a few more questions from the audience, and I'm going to try my best to bring them in. But before I do, allow me just to quickly go to Madame Four once more. Madame, I want to bring UNICEF back into the spotlight here and ask the question: what for UNICEF would constitute appropriate social protection for children as we enter this third decade of the 21st century? We heard some of the stats that you shared with us in your first offering, and of course we heard also Madame Bachelet saying earlier on that children should be at the center, but they're not. So what would be appropriate in your view?
Thank you, Nosy. So I think many of us have gotten complacent. We see the services around us on nutrition and health and education and water and sanitation and protection, and we think that they're available for everyone, but they are not. And what you are bringing in is that our world has changed. There are two very big movements that are roiling through our world. One is climate change, and one is conflict. And I think what we have seen in recent days is that these are faster, they are stronger, and they are longer lived than what we had been planning in the 20th century. So we all need to relook at our plans, and we need to readjust. So at UNICEF, we are just right now putting the finishing touches on our strategic plan for the next 4 years. And in it are 5 pillars. And one of the pillars is social protection, inclusive social protection as a way to reduce child poverty. We feel that it's absolutely critical to address the gaps, and it is the gaps in every country, but it is particularly for the marginalized populations within a country. For all of us have those marginalized populations, but we need to expand coverage. The majority of children do not have access to social protection coverage, and we need to rapidly expand it. To Guy Ryder's earlier comments about what's happened during the pandemic, this is the moment when the world can stand up and should. And there are some comments in the chat about the informal sector. That is exactly what they need. They need this moment in time for us to step up. So let me turn to Michelle's wonderful comment about where there is a will, there is a way. And she showed that as a world leader. But for many, social protection that is inclusive is not yet part of a country's systems. So what could you do? You could really look at the families who have children with disabilities, who have children that are on the move, the specific needs of girls and women. For inclusive social protection system, it would be child benefits, maternity and paternity leave benefits, child care services, specific benefits for those who are caring for children with disabilities, gender responsive and disability inclusive care services. All of these can be ignored in a society, but once you realize that we need them, it becomes a mission. So where there's a will, there's a way, to Michelle's good words. And then social protection is increasingly important with the number of fragile and humanitarian settings that we now have. The world is getting tougher. Many of the humanitarian conflicts are lasting longer. They are deeper, more severe, more violent than we have seen before. So it's particularly important that we roll it out there. And the increase in climate change, disasters and crises is something that we are grappling with as a world, but we have a greater number, greater severity. So finally, let me add to the comments that Michelle and Roberto and Sharon made about social protection being an investment. It is an investment. Children are an investment. We need to have staying power. So we need to have sustainable and well-financed social protection system. And I really commend the World Bank and the ILO and other partners who are working on these. There is a risk that the world will return to austerity. And that is something that we should all try to work together to expand coverage. It's an investment, certainly, for the children and their families. Thank you, Nosy.
Madame, for children are an investment. If you're not treating that, I'm not sure what you're teaching. That's got to be one of the sound bites of the day. And of course, as you are lifting and reinforcing the fact that social protection is an investment, but also calling for us to really think clearly about the comprehensiveness, the adequacy, the coverage issues when we're looking at social protection systems and policies to support that. I want to put a quick question from Christine to the Director General, to Mr. Ryder. DG, Christine is asking, what about the fact that sometimes social protection is seen as charity or welfare? How do we change this perception so that it is seen as a right and becomes more rights-based? Your thoughts on that, please, sir.
Well, yes, you do hear that stigmatization of social protection and the recipients of social protection. Somehow they are undeserving. And, you know, in the days before social protection systems existed in many of our societies, people would refuse. I mean, people relied on charity rather than social protection as a right. And a great shame and great social stigmatization went with it. I think we simply have to make the case. It's a simple case, simple point, that we are talking about a human right. There are many other supporting cases for social protection, be they the economic case, the investment case, the business case. But basically, this is about people's basic rights. It is an entitlement. And that's why, certainly at the ILO, we're always anxious to get across this message that social protection should be a systematic, rights-based entitlement, not simply a safety net that is extended to you out of the generosity of governments at a time when need is particularly acute. So it's a fundamental point. It is a problem that exists in the minds of some, and indeed is propagated by certain sectors of political opinion. We just have to simply oppose it. And I think if we do it strongly enough, we will win that argument.
DG, I think it's an excellent response, and it forces me to bring to you just a quick follow-up question from Bismol, who's also in our global audience, because Bismol is saying, are we doing a good job of convincing governments that social protection needs to be part of the recovery plans, especially if what we have learned is that there have been many gaps in social protection before, and many of these recovery plans are potentially not aligned to building back better, but trying to build back to what was before. How do we ensure that we don't repeat what we had and instead really see this as part of a broader recovery?
Well, that's sort of the critical question, isn't it? Because I think the evidence in our report is that performance of recent years has been inadequate. Governments, for whatever reason, whatever the obstacles may have been, perceived or real, we simply haven't done well enough in extending social protection in the way that I think we all want. So the question that's posed, and it really is today, is as we hopefully gather momentum in the recovery process, are we going to build in that real movement towards universal social protection as part of the building back or building forward better agenda? Now, all of us, I think, agree here that we don't want to go back to where we started before the crisis, not in respect of social protection, not in respect of a lot of other things, by the way, as well. So the question then becomes a very practical one. If we are agreed, if we have that consensus that we need to move forward in a new direction, how are we going to do it? What would it take? And I think we've got some of the answers from the mindsets, which Philip Alston has emphasized, to the financial side of things, mobilizing the resources necessary locally, nationally, and internationally, and then applying the know-how, because there is a question of capacities here too, to put in place the types of systems which actually, if I can put it like this, deliver the goods, deliver the social protection goods. So it really is that crossroads which it appears in the title of our social protection report, that we really have to move forward in the right direction along.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryder. And as we stand at those crossroads, confronted with these choices, perhaps, Mr. Alston, let me bring you back, because one of the big conversations at bubbling, I wouldn't even say under the surface, I would say right on top of the surface, is the universal basic income conversation, and the extent to which it could play a role in achieving universal social protection. I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that role, but also in the candid spirit that you have lifted some cautions as well. Are there pitfalls that we need to be mindful of?
Thanks, Nosy. Let me start with one other point, which is prompted by some of Guy Ryder's comments, and that is to bring in, although some will resist this because it seems just too much and too big, climate change. Let's think about what climate change is going to do in terms of social protection. There's going to be massive disruption in terms of overnight devastation that people will suffer in many places around the world. Loss of jobs, loss of home, loss of everything that they have. There's going to be huge uprooting. There's going to be massive migration flows. Where does social protection fit in? If we're doing things on a sort of ad hoc basis, if we're responding to particular crises and saying, oh, we need to mobilize new payments for these people, etc., we're not going to keep up. In a world riven by climate change, it's going to be imperative to have in place automatic, comprehensive social protection systems. And we need to be starting to think in those terms as well. Your question about the relationship between universal basic income and social protection, there's actually a curious relationship between the two. Social protection risks always being a minimalist conversation. As Guy Ryder said, a safety net sort of mentality. If things really get grim, then we have to help these people. Universal basic income risks being the opposite, a sort of maximalist conversation that everything has to be given to everyone and it has to be very generous. But the reality is that social protection is only going to be achieved if we can appeal to broader constituencies. And talking about poverty, for example, I was special rapporteur on poverty for 6 years. It's very important, but it doesn't persuade the great majority of people who still have the mindset that Guy Ryder talked about, that these people somehow are undeserving. And so universal basic income brings in other elements which are very useful as reminders that we need to go beyond traditional notions of economic growth. We need to see that people can make constructive contributions in many ways, and not only through labour, although perhaps I shouldn't say that in front of Sharon Burrow and Guy Ryder. We need to emphasise dignity and not charity, and universal basic income does that. And we need deeper reform of our economic and social structures. And universal basic income is visionary, if nothing else. And so while at the end of the day, social protection is the much more attainable goal and the one that should be embodied in law, should lead to a claim that people can make, the broader debate on universal basic income actually brings a lot to the table.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alston. And I'm going to keep you on the line a little bit because, you know, as you talk about universal basic income and the invitation or the challenge, if you will, through this lens of a curious relationship, which I loved the use of language there, the invitation to move away from the minimalist sort of safety net perception, but really to begin to think broader. There's a question that came from our audience a little earlier on, asking about the role of development finance institutions and whether they could do more in order to help to close the financing gap. I think the number that the DG shared was 97 billion annually, if I haven't got it incorrect. What are your thoughts on that? Could DFIs come more deliberately to the party?
I think that we are seeing a gap, this is not unusual, of course, between the rhetoric and the reality. I think there has been a movement. Kristalina Georgieva has obviously brought a new sensitivity, new sensibility to the work of the IMF. But if you look at the Oxfam studies, for example, of the sort of conditions that are being included in IMF loan arrangements, what you find is that it's pretty much business as usual. If you look at what the World Bank is doing, they will talk about social protection, but still deep down, there is this sense that it is needs to be subject to conditionality, that it is a last resort social safety net rather than a matter of human rights. So there's no doubt that the financial institutions are crucial to all of this, but I don't think that they have made the real move in terms of mindsets. They're starting to talk the talk, but I don't think they are really walking the walk in terms of social protection.
Thank you so much, Mr. Olsen. Again, so we're having a range of views, and it's always appreciated to say we're beginning to see indications of belief in the shared vision, but we need to hold ourselves accountable to see beyond the talk, how is this translating into lending models and maybe the relaxing of conditionalities as we're hearing. I want to go to Mr. Roberto Suarez Santos once more, and I want to bring in the changing world of work. Which we all know has both inherent in it challenges and opportunities. Adjusting to the disruptions and seizing the positive opportunities we know requires adaptation both from the workers but also from employers. In your view, Mr. Santos, how can social protection help smoothen the transition for both?
There are three angles and three important elements. This is not just about mobilizing resources. I agree with the previous speaker, with Philip, and it has to do also with climate change and all other structural realities that we have to face in the very short term. More and more workers are working in the platform economies as freelancers, and there are new realities of employment that we have to face. And we have not been shy on that. I mean, as an international organization of employers, we say this is a challenge, and there is a need also to progressively cover these new workers, if we can call them like that, with social protection schemes. That's one angle. Having said that, also, we need to look at the sustainability angle in the middle and long term. If we really want to make a difference to avoid this stigmatization, we need to look to the social protection schemes in the middle and long term. And we also have to face the reality that more and more, we have a demographic trend, not just in developed economies, but also in developing economies. I mean, in 2015, the forecast is that the people beyond 65 will multiply by 3, if I'm not wrong. All very well. I mean, not just in developed economies, but in developing economies. But more important than that, for transitions to a job to another, social protection schemes are becoming crucial. If I have an income, and this income is linked to an active policy in an efficient manner, meaning by that it stimulates me to look for another job, to train myself, to have guidance. If that works, and we have countries in which that works enormously well, in an incredible manner, that make a difference. That overcome this stigmatization, and that's what we need to face the climate change challenge. That's what we really need to also to face this transition. Bring this efficiency to the social protection schemes. So more and more, we need to apply our mind to let us leave aside our ideological components on both sides and bring this efficiency to the social protection schemes and employment benefits, but also other kind of incomes. If we do that, we will be building sustainable social protection schemes, and we'll have a positive spillover. That's how I see that.
Mr. Santos, I think it's an incredible opportunity that you're speaking to, this idea that when efficient and working at its optimal, social protection schemes will allow workers to upskill and reskill. And as the world continues to be dynamic, the world of work continues to be dynamic, they're able to upskill and get different employment opportunities. What I do want to just do a quick follow-up question on you for is that you speak about the social protection schemes, and I'm keen to understand from the underlying design principles, what do you think we'd need to get right in order for social protection schemes to be sustainable, to be efficient, as you are describing? Are there 2 or 3 non-negotiable design principles that you think we need to be thinking about that will lead to the sustainability and the efficiency that you've proposed?
Sustainability means, on one side, you need a safety net and the right-based approach that we agree on, and we're going to be very clear on that. But on the other side, you have complementary levels and also employment-related social protection schemes, I would call it like that, in which you need to give a push to efficiency. And in order to do that, I don't know whether that's not negotiable or not. I think it's the only way forward. You need to bring these social protection schemes, these incomes that you received, to social protection schemes with active policies, what we call in labor market active policies. If you bring those really together in an effective manner, which is not the case in many countries, you will have a sustainable future for social protection. You will bring more resources. And in order to bring also more resources, and I agree, it's not just about bringing more resources, but it's very important. You also have to diversify the sources. You have a first pillar, you have a second pillar, and you have a third pillar. You really have to play with the three of them, knowing that you have to put very much attention to the public component of social protection, which is also a kind of sacred element in the ILO, and we share that also.
Mr. Santos, thank you very much. And so we're hearing you talking about bringing employment-related social protection into focus, but also with labor market policies that are complementary to what is being built for a sustainable future. I want to come back to Madame Barrow. I've got at least a minimum of two. If I can squeeze in another question, I certainly will. But I want to come to you, Madame Barrow. You know, climate change certainly has been one of the themes that we've been referring to throughout the conversation. And we know that it's really manifesting now in ways that could be best described as terrible, but also impossible to ignore. We know that mitigating and adapting to climate change is going to require multiple and coordinated policy responses, but also drastic behavior change. I think it was Mr. Alston who spoke about mindset changes that lead to behavior change. The question to you, Madame, is what role, in your view, can social protection play in the vital effort to stop runaway climate change? That's the first question I'd like to bring to you.
Thank you, Nosy. And can I just say, Philip would actually understand it when I say this. I grew up in a country and in a union movement that fought for what we called the social wage. That's today called social protection. It's what percentage of your wage actually do you pay in tax for shared services, for looking after the poor, for creating the resilience of social protection. So I must say, when I hear people talk about social protection as a safety net, or social protection as a reductionist view, or the underserved, I'm sure COVID-19 has exposed that we're all at risk. We are all at risk. So while I do, urge people to think of income and look at that 18%, it's a scandal that in fact only 18% of people have unemployment guarantees in income terms. But while I encourage people to think of universal basic income as a component of social protection, I would also say when it's necessary. Because why should we pay billionaires or even people on my salary or those in secure jobs a universal basic income when we have the kind of child poverty and adult poverty that you heard talked about? And climate will just exacerbate that, because we already saw the health crisis, the pandemic expose all of the risks that are associated with underfunding of vital services that are social protection: health, education, aged care, childcare, income support, where lives, jobs, livelihoods were affected. The climate emergency is no different. People and planet have to be at the centre of recovery, and social protection is the resilience foundation in that, if we're to deal with any of these global shocks. But if you just read the latest IPCC report, it's like reading a horror novel. It actually says we are running out of time. We are simply running out of time, and urgent action is needed to embrace the vital transitions. But vulnerable people will not accept a transition if they can't see some security and a future with secure jobs, social protection, just transitions. So that's why we fight for a just transition. We know that indeed, if we don't have a living planet, if we don't have an inclusive future, then we have no guarantees for any of the peoples, let alone the working people who make the wealth that we need to distribute. And I just remind everybody that in 2015, world leaders made two great promises to the world. One was the SDGs by 2030, to actually get beyond these traditional divides, as Roberto said, beyond the ideology, and create inclusive growth, and the Paris Climate Agreement These were roadmaps in our language to a zero poverty, zero carbon world. But if we don't strengthen social protection, if we're not all committed to looking after people in what is an incredible transition, and just look at the ILO Just Transition Guidelines, they give us an understanding of why people have to work together. Social protection is vital. Social dialogue to get us the industrial transformations we need is essential. So climate change is just one more reason for making a resilience foundation possible for everybody where social protection is guaranteed.
Social protection as the resilient foundation that we want for the people and planet that we're wanting. That's some of the sound bites you've shared with us, Madam Barrow. But before you go, I do want to bring in a question from Isabel to you. Isabel is saying, what should we be doing differently as the global community if we are really going to change the reality of, I think a beautiful phrase that Philip used earlier is not the worst off, but the worst off. If we're going to ensure that we're really not excluding the most vulnerable from government social protections, the global community, what should we be doing differently?
So I'm going to circle right back to say the global communities has to look at solidarity. We've seen the disasters of the divisions over vaccine nationalism. But again, I simply say, and I know it sounds cliched, but if everybody's not vaccinated, then indeed no one is safe. We can't actually reopen economies with securities without putting lives at risk. So that global social protection fund, sharing an amount of our wealth to set up systems that in themselves become self-sustaining and basic economies. You saw the figure we put out, 1.9% return on investment. Social protection is not a safety net. It's a resilience foundation for everybody, poor, rich, employed, unemployed. We're all going to find ourselves in situations that we've not encountered before. Members of our families, members of our communities. Let's fund each other to have let me use my old language, the social wage that is in fact the dividend you get from paying taxation. Unions have never been opposed to taxation. Fair taxation is essential so we don't tax the workers more than we tax the corporations, which is the case today. But we cannot have a society that's so unequal, that is not prepared to share its wealth. And I simply never understand, Nosy, why, if we're so keen on building wealth, why are we as a global community so opposed to sharing it? Because the economics 101 of that is if you share wealth, if you build wealth together, you actually share prosperity and it's a virtuous circle. So let's get the solidarity from the global community that builds resilience in all of our poorest countries as well as in our own.
Thank you, Madame Barrow. If we are so committed to building wealth, why do we struggle with shared prosperity and sharing that wealth? Certainly a provocative statement that is an open invitation for us to really lean into the conversation. I've got time for one more question. I'm going to sneak one into to you, Madame Fo, if I could call on you once more. It comes from the audience. It comes from Christine once more. And Christine is saying the human-centered approach. And maybe I'm going to rather put this to Madame Bachelet because I think it actually really focuses on human rights. So let me do that and then see if Madame Fo, you'd like to comment on that as well. So Madame Bachelet, let me call on you. Christine is asking and saying the human-centered approach and human rights approach in other programs have not moved women and children up the ladder in terms of inequalities and disparities. What do we need to do differently?
Well, I think that there has been progress over the years. I mean, if we think what happened to women 100 years ago, 50 years ago, there has been progress. The problem is that we have been having setbacks on women's rights and on human rights as well. So what I would say is we need to show, I mean, we need to do much more. We need to focus, of course, on human rights on a principle basis, that women deserve the same rights, the same opportunities that as human beings, and that deserve all human rights to be protected and preserved. But you know what? When people make decisions, when people are in political positions, sometimes that narrative is not enough for them to make the right decisions. When I was at UN Women, I learned that to speak about women's rights that it was the right thing to do, it was okay, I will do it, I will continue to do it my whole life. But I found out that when you talk with certain stakeholders, you need to show them as well that it's not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. How it can be positive for them, for the country, for the people, for the constituencies, for everyone, politically, socially, yes, humanly, culturally speaking. And we also think we need to do much better showing the fantastic contribution of women in the development of the countries. And on that, and I always remember when I talked to the ministers of the Nordic countries, he said to be one of them said, they usually think that we have gender equality because we're rich countries, and we have to explain, no, we were really poor countries, and we are now rich countries. We were able to contribute to every man, every woman, every man could have the education, the opportunities, so now they can contribute with all their capacities to the development of the society. So I think there's a lot of human rights arguments, but also we need to show that is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do.
Thank you very much, Madame Bachelet. Madame Four, I see you on my screen, which is excellent. Let's hear your comment on this. What do we need to do differently to really make a human-centered approach for children work?
So to build on Michelle's comments, sometimes we forget that every one of us is empowered to be able to do something. So at a UNICEF, we can put it into our strategic plan. We can weave women and girls into every one of our programs. If you are a corporation, you can put it into your corporate models for products and services in your own people. If you're just at home looking at your own home, you can encourage your daughters to become digitally literate so that they become the talent pool of the future that Michelle is talking about. I mean, every one of us can do something to help girls and women, and we should do it. That's the key.
Madame Four, it's an excellent close to our conversation. Just before I go to Mr. Guy Ryder for his final thoughts in the conversation, allow me to ask our audience once more. Here's a final poll coming up on your screen right now. I'm going to ask the team to kindly please launch the poll. There it is. It's one question. How do you see social protection in your country in the next 5 years? Are you going to see a country that's going to invest decisively, or invest a little more, or invest more or less the same? Do you think your country is going to invest less in social protection, or invest a lot less? Or do you not know? Let's give that 10 seconds, because that's going to be a very, very quick one. And so as I close the poll and ask the team to do the same, I'm going to pop up the response. And DG, I'm hoping that you're going to pick up the baton from here as we look at how our audience is reflecting on the conversation. And what we're seeing on our screens, at 33%, we're seeing some optimism coming through. Invest a little more in social protection. And supposing that investing decisively is really where we want to get to, we still have much work to do. DG, your final comments in this conversation.
Well, thanks, Nosy, and I benefit from that poll that has just been shown, which, as you've said, leads to a degree of optimism. I'm not going to put it more strongly than that, but a degree of optimism, because this is a poll, not what you want to happen, but what you think is going to happen, right? So there is a feeling that governments are going to step up and do a little bit better, at least. I want to argue that we need to set our ambitions higher than the expectation reflected in that poll. But let me just try, and I'm going to have to do it extremely concisely, to reflect what I think we've heard in our discussion this afternoon. I mean, I think we're as one in deploring the inadequacies that we know exist in social protection arrangements today, both in terms of coverage, adequacy, and we're as one as well in agreeing that there are multiple cases that all coincide in being in support of investing in better social protection arrangements. It's about the mindset case, about the business case, the social case, the economic case, and something which I think hasn't come out at least explicitly, but which is important. You know, having good social protection actually facilitates change and adaptation at work and in life. You know, if some change is coming, you can embrace that change if you know you can have recourse to some type of protection. You know, it's a lubricant of change, not an obstruction of change. So we're as one on all of that. We're as one in agreeing that social protection is a right. And it makes you wonder when you hear all of this, you know, violent agreement, why we're not moving forward better and more decisively. You know, what's stopping us if we're all agreed? And things are stopping us, of course. The first thing I want to say is, before COVID-19, there were very lively debates about all sorts of things to do with social protection. You know, big debates about the reform of social protection systems, about their sustainability in the face of demographic change and aging societies, the right balance between contributory and tax-based system, the right balance between public and private provision. More recently, this whole debate on universal basic income, upon which we could probably benefit from a separate panel one day. So this wasn't a static debate, but it's been dynamized by COVID-19. And, you know, my own view is now we are facing a moment of opportunity, a moment of responsibility. There have been moments, haven't there, in history, when the world has decided to make truly qualitative advances in respect of social protection and in other things as well. The world's done that, not universally, but on a smaller basis, a narrower basis. The world has decided to put in place in many societies very important measures of social protection, which transformed people's lives, which transformed societies. And in some of our countries, my own included, you know, this was done under the sort of the heading of freedom from fear. I think it's a very eloquent phrase. These are the types of measures that stop people having to wake up in the morning and being genuinely frightened about what happens if they lose their job, or if they get sick, or if they get injured at work, or lose their job, or not if, but when they get old. And social protection frees people from that visceral fear, that fear that lives in your stomach, nowhere else. And surely there can be no greater imperative compulsion to action than the fact that still the majority of the world's population lives in those conditions of fear. You know, whatever their actual circumstances, the risk, the threat is out there that one day, because they have no social protection, they are going to be left defenseless, facing the vicissitudes of life. So we've got to put this together now. Seize the moment of responsibility, I would say, not opportunity, the moment of responsibility. We've already agreed to do this in the 2030 agenda, let's not forget that. But we have to put what I would say is the righteous indignation that we all feel about the current situation. We have to put that together with our expertise, our standards, our knowledge, and there's plenty of it. And then we have to get the investment, the funding part together. If any one of those components is missing, we're not going to get there. We're not going to do as much as we need to do. And so we have to work with our friends in the financial institutions, in the multilateral development banks. Maybe the answer lies through a global social protection fund. My own view is it's not the establishment of the fund that will make the difference. It's getting the money into the fund that will make the difference. And that's where we need to set our horizons. But one thing is for sure, when you get people like we have in the debate today and all of those following the debate, you know, building up this head of steam for action, two sides of industry, different parts of the international system, and everybody else following us. And we all say, we are not going to tolerate a return to the status quo before COVID-19. And we're going to take the high road towards universal social protection. Then perhaps we'll live up to this moment of responsibility. Thanks, Nosy.
Thank you very much to the Director General. Perhaps we would live up to this moment of responsibility to really see everyone coming through without fear and being free from fear. These are some of the words that we are using to lift from the Director General as we close off this conversation. I'd like to extend a massive thank you to our audience and to apologize for being 4 minutes over. There wasn't a single question that I felt that we could have done away with. To thank the Director General, to thank Madame Ford, to thank Madame Bachelet, to thank Mr. Alston, to thank Madame Barrow, to thank Mr. Santos for their time, and to remind you, the hashtag is social protection and hashtag USP 2030. We're following the handle SOC_protection. And I'd love to keep the conversation going with you. Follow me too at The Real Nosy. For now, it's goodbye, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.